I have some crepe myrtles in my front yard that have completely grown out of control. They were growing into each other, and a neighbor gave me some tips on how to prune them down to a manageable size. So I did. I chopped those trees down fairly low, but pretty soon they were growing out of control again. My neighbor came by and he said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you about the second step. After the initial pruning, you have to come back and pull off the little branches that are too close to the ground." And then she said, "You need to tell the tree where you want it to grow." I thought that was very helpful advice. It is advice we're trying to practice with our trees in our yard. So maybe wondering, what does this have to do with authors? Am I even listening to the right podcast? Well, as authors, sometimes we have to say no to good things in order to say yes to better things. It hurts to cut away part of our lives that seem good or that are good, right? The branches that I cut off of those crepe myrtles were good branches. They were making flowers. They weren't making many flowers, but they were making flowers. My hope is that they will make more flowers in the future now that it has been pruned down. But you have to do that pruning of the good in order to make room for the better, in order for the tree to flourish. To succeed in anything difficult, you need to focus, and you can't focus on your book if you're overcommitted to other good things, right? It's easy to prune the dead wood. It's easy to cut the dead branches, but that's typically not enough. So back in 2019, we had an episode called Focus, Pruning, and Why Novel Marketing is About to Change. And in that episode, I talked about a mental breakdown that I'd had because I was overcommitted. And I was going through a tough season of pruning. I got rid of the plugins. I stepped down from being a literary agent. I stopped traveling, or I stopped taking on new speaking gigs. And I had a co-host of the podcast at that time, James L. Rubart, and he was also going through a season of pruning. In fact, for him, what got pruned was the podcast. So he stopped being a regular host. And listeners have asked, how did it go? What were the results of that season of pruning? And I imagine they're asking, did you make any mistakes we could avoid as we go through our own pruning and our own honing to improve our writing? Well, find out in this episode of Novel Marketing, the longest running book marketing podcast in the world. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr., CEO of Author Media, and this is the show for writers who want to build their platform, sell more books, and make a living writing books worth talking about. And joining us today is that special guest to talk to us about pruning. He's a Christie Hall of Fame author, a former co-host of the Novel Marketing Podcast, and pruner extraordinaire, James L. Rubart. Welcome back to the Novel Marketing Podcast.
Thomas, thank you for having me. I love it. And I would not say I am a pruner extraordinaire. I would say I am a pruner trier. I'm a trier pruner.
A journeyman pruner.
A journeyman pruner, yes.
Yeah. So it's been 3.5 years since we recorded that episode about pruning. So what happened?
For me, dropping Novel Marketing was extremely difficult. It was an emotional moment, certainly, but doing that really, truly freed me up. And so for me, it was not only the time that I got, but the emotional weight of having that gone was it was a good move. I was able to channel more of that energy into the Rubart Writing Academy that my son and I were running. It enabled me to channel energy into some of the hobbies that I enjoy. I know you're at that stage of life, Thomas, where it's like, hobbies? What are you talking about? I've got kids.
I have three little hobbies. They're running around. 3 little hobbies, right? Needing diaper changes.
And yet that's so important that we have interest in things going on outside of our careers. And so it was the ability simply to do that. It was the ability to do nothing. It was the ability not to have everything feeling like everything's going on all the time.
And now you've pruned even the Rubart Writing Academy. You're not doing that either.
Right. So I've continued to prune Rubart Writing Academy. Taylor and I are not doing that anymore. His business was taking off, and we just felt like that season had come to an end. So I pruned that. And yet, Thomas, I have the feeling that I still have to do some more pruning. Do you feel that? Do you still look at your life and go, there's more to prune?
I do. And it's one thing to know something needs to go, but it's something else to know what needs to go.
Right.
Because what got pruned was very different for us, right? I pruned everything but the podcast. You primarily pruned the podcast. What led you to knowing that it was the podcast that needed to go?
Because it was the biggest chunk of time that I did not at that point in time absolutely have to do. And again, that's the hard decision. I read a book a couple years ago, and I'm rereading it right now, called Essentialism. And one of the things Greg points out in that book is we are fond of bantering the phrase, well, let me talk to you about my priorities, Thomas. And what he points out is we invented the word priorities. No, it's priority. There's one priority. And he mentions this gal that he was consulting with in the book, and she says, here are my 18 priorities. He says that you can't have 18 priorities. And so how do we decide that one thing? That is the difficult choice. And because I'm someone that has always had many interests, many hobbies, as well as many professional interests, that's the tough choice. What do I cut?
And for me, it was looking at the synergies. So, for instance, my book has nothing to do with book marketing. And building my brand as the dating and relationships guy really confused my brand as the book marketing guy. And so that, for me, helped me know, okay, this isn't helping. It's a good thing in itself, but it's not helping the other things that I'm doing. Mm-hmm. While my other podcast, The Christian Publishing Show, does have synergies, right? Some of you listening, you listen to this podcast, Novel Marketing, and you listen to Christian Publishing Show. In fact, some of you probably discovered Novel Marketing because you first heard about me through that other podcast. And so that is a synergy, right? And there's another kind of synergy that I talked about in the crop rotation episode, where there's a kind of activity that's very different from what you're doing, but it recharges you so that you kind of switch back and forth and you're always charged up, right? So you're planting the wheat, and that prepares the soil for the beans, and the beans prepare the soil for the next thing, and you rotate through and you're always energetic for the thing that you're doing. That's another good synergy. But if you're just drained, or if one of the things just leaves you drained, it doesn't leave you charged up for anything. It's like, maybe that's not the right crop for my soil. It's not playing to my strengths. So that was September 2019. We did that episode. And in December of that same year, we had baby number 3. So we spent 2 months with a brand new baby. And I was actually very glad I did all that pruning, because my wife needed me to chase the other 2 that were 1 and 2 years old at the time while she was recovering from giving birth. So now we're coming into 2020 and the pandemic hits. And I had just pruned everything going into 2020. And so I actually had a fairly empty plate. And so I looked this up doing research for this episode. I did a series of webinars right as the lockdowns were started for authors, because I knew all of the writers' conferences had been canceled. And so I did a series of free webinars. And I was like, how quickly did I do that first webinar? So here in Austin, our lockdown was March 20th. It was the official start of the lockdown, according to Wikipedia. And I looked up the date of my first of those webinars, and you know what the date was? March 20th.
Seriously.
So,
wow.
And I did 2 or 3 webinars a week for those first 2 or 3 weeks, because I was ready. I'd already dropped everything, and there was desperate need for it amongst authors. People were panicking. This was in the very scary time of the pandemic. And the result of that series of webinars, I want to say I added 2,000 email addresses to my list, maybe more. There was a massive jump in the email list, a massive jump in goodwill with people. So I didn't charge anything for those webinars. I just gave them as a gift. A lot of them were just talks that I normally gave at writers' conferences, right? That was in the we're all in this together phase of the pandemic before we all went at each other's throats. And it's hard to remember what early 2020 was like. But as we went into Book Launch Blueprint, and in May of 2020, we had, I want to say, 3 times more students in 2020 than we had in 2019. And I think a lot of that was because of the pruning, because I had the capacity. Because if I'd been a literary agent and dealing with all of my clients panicking about, oh my goodness, my publisher just delayed my contract because of the lockdown, there's no paper, right? If I'd have had to been negotiating all of that and helping people with that, which would have been a good thing, right? I would have been a good agent to help them with that. I wouldn't have been able to do that webinar on March 20th, and then again and on March 23rd, and 2 more times the next week. And because I'd done that pruning ahead of time, I was well positioned. And a lot of other people did virtual summits and online stuff in 2020, but it was often later in the year because it took them time to get stuff wrapped down and prepped. And so in many ways, me being able to be a professional course creator was birthed out of all that pruning. Because that pruning was scary. I was making money doing those things that I was cutting, and I didn't know where the new money was going to come from. And if I hadn't have gone through the mental breakdown, I don't think I would have been able to do the pruning because it was very scary financially. But the money did show up, right? The new students did come, right? Novel marketing now has 2 to 3 times more listeners than it did when we did that pruning episode. And so the growth has come, right? That focus, that greater attention, that greater effort has resulted in more fruit, right? As it was with trees and plants and flowers, it has been with my career. And so it really has paid a dividend, right? So because we didn't know at the time what the results were going to be, right? It was I have to prune in order to stay alive. Right. And for you, I don't think it was quite so desperate. I don't think you were in quite as bad of a place. Your tree didn't need pruning quite as bad as mine. But what are your thoughts looking back?
Yeah, I don't think it did need as much. But what I've realized looking back on it is I needed to give myself permission. And here's what I mean by permission. And this was probably 2015. And we were at one of our mastermind retreats. And I was just starting to do other people's audiobooks. I'd done a bunch of my own, but I was starting to do other people's audiobooks. And I was really enjoying that. And Lacey just made the offhand comment, oh, maybe that's what you'll end up doing. And deep down in my heart, something jumped and said, yes, I would love to do that. I would love to only do that. But I did not give myself permission to think that. It's like, no, I'm co-host of the Novel Marketing Podcast, and I'm a novelist, and I need to keep writing novels, and I'm a speaker and a teacher, and I need to keep going to conferences. And so I didn't allow myself to say, yeah, it's okay. You don't have to write novels forever. You don't have to do novel marketing forever. But I didn't know that at the time. And so now I'm giving myself permission to go, sure.
Yeah. Because, in some ways, right, once you're in the Hall of Fame, your motivation shift a little bit, I imagine, right? It's like, what do I want to do with my time? And it's interesting how once you achieve your goals, you're like, do I want to keep accomplishing this goal, or do I want to pivot into something else? Do I want to start helping other authors have success, or do I want to be a part of the industry in some other way, right? Become a literary agent, become an audiobook narrator, become a publisher myself.
Yes, that's exactly it. And so anybody listening going, no, I have to keep doing this. No, you don't. Not necessarily. I had 3 goals in life. I wanted to be a great husband, I wanted to be a great dad, and I wanted to be a successful novelist. And it's like, okay, I've done those 3. What's next? And I look back on my life because I thought, well, I'm going to be writing novels forever. And I think I will. I think I will write again. I've got that itch and I've got a story idea. And so I will start writing again. But honestly, I've been somebody that has gotten fairly good at one thing. It's like, cool, all right, now I'm going to go on to something else. Now I'm going to go on to something else. Now I'm going to go on to something else. I just need that constant learning, constant stimulus. And again, I'm giving myself permission to say, that's not a flaw, Jim. That's okay.
Well, it leads to a much more successful life than trying to do all of the things at the same time.
Right.
This is the Benjamin Franklin secret, right? Benjamin Franklin was a successful almost everything, right? He was a successful author, business owner, a scientist, a politician, a diplomat, right? Like each one of those things are careers most people dedicate their whole lives to. And he was able to do all of those things and even more. If you study his life, it's quite remarkable. But as you dig deeper, you realize that he was only doing one of those things at a time. When he was doing his publishing company, he was all in on running his printing press. And that focus is really powerful. And I think it allows us to focus if we realize, okay, this is just for a season. Right now, I am 100% focused on my book, and I have made a lot of sacrifices to give my book this focus. But those sacrifices aren't forever. Those hobbies I can reclaim in the future. Those other activities I can start up again in the future. And that will lead to success more often than trying to do all the things all at the same time.
And the sense of satisfaction, I think, is much deeper. And I am learning that lesson actually right now. I have pruned virtually every hobby out of my life because back in 1993, I rode the Seattle to Portland bike race. So it's 200-mile ride over 2 days. You do 100 miles a day. And Taylor was 6 months old as I rode. And I said to myself, oh my gosh, this is so fun. Someday I'd love to do it with Taylor. Well, someday's here. And Taylor and I are going to do it this year together. What I discovered quickly is getting in shape at 30 years old is different than getting in shape at 60 years old. When you're 30, you go for a few rides. I'm good. At 60, I have really had to work at this hard. I am riding my bike nearly every day. I've got a training program. I am seriously going after this. And because I've put everything to the side and because I am so focused on this, I am getting in phenomenal shape, and it just feels great to take that time to put that energy into it, kind of this thing you were talking about with Benjamin Franklin. And after it, yeah, I'll continue to ride, but not with the intensity that I'm riding right now. So like you say, it's a season.
Of any of the things that you pruned, do you regret pruning them, or you're like, gosh, I wish I hadn't quit that thing back when I did?
That's an interesting question. No, I don't regret any of them. I mean, there's things I've put on hold, and that's fine because I know I can pick those up again. But it has mentally sharpened me in a way. I'll give you an example. We live in an area of the country where it's the United States' biggest surf pool. So you can go there, get on your surfboard and surf in this pool. And I'm like, oh, I got to do that. And absolutely, but not until July 17th after you ride, because you can't get injured. So even in that sense, I am pruning something, a desire I want to do for the greater good, which is this bike race. And then after that, sure, go. And if you get hurt, no big deal. So I think it's applying that mental discipline to every area of your life.
And that's really powerful, right? You're not saying no, you're saying not yet.
Right.
So it's very helpful with my wife and me when we were dating, right? When we were saying no, we were saying not yet, right? For everything, there is a season. And it's interesting because of all the things that I pruned, I don't regret pruning any of those things either.
Wow.
Right. Like I enjoyed them in the moment. And I think the most surprising thing is the plugins, because those are my babies, right? Yeah. Creating the world's most popular bookstore plugin for WordPress. That was a big deal, right? I worked a long time on that. We had 2 Kickstarter campaigns for that plugin. That was a big part of my professional success. It was a big part of my identity. And if the company that I sold them to offered them back to me, I wouldn't want it. It was like,
right.
All right, that was great for its season, but I don't want that responsibility back. And the freedom now of being able to focus on what I am doing is so much better. Being able to really focus on being a podcaster and figuring out how to make a living doing this thing that didn't exist when I graduated high school. And it's tricky. And as a sole breadwinner, right, I'm providing for my family. My wife has her hands full with the kids. In fact, my hands are full with the kids half the time too. This is kind of scary, right? It's not like, oh yeah, I'll just do what my dad did, right? It's like there was no podcasting back then. And it's very different than radio. Like while we're talking into microphones like radio people do, the business model and the structure of it is very different, right? You didn't support your radio station financially, but some of you support this podcast financially. And I love every one of you. I appreciate every one of you. And I couldn't do this show the way that I do if I hadn't gone through that pruning. And it's interesting because it was so difficult at the time. I don't know if this was the case for you, but like giving up those things, stepping down, for some of them, it was easy because it was just so stressful. I couldn't even. But for other things, I was like, man, I really love this. I don't really want to cut it. And yet, looking back, I wouldn't, if I were given the choice, I wouldn't switch.
Yeah. And one of the struggles I've had, I don't know if you've had this struggle, Thomas, but some of the things that have been hard to prune and give up is because I don't want to hurt somebody else's feelings. And that sounds altruistic, but it's not. Because ultimately, I'm a Jesus follower, and so Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, right? The number one thing is guard your heart, for from it flow the wellsprings of life. And so it's, Jim, do you need to guard your heart in this area? Well, yeah, but it's going to hurt that person's, Jim. You have to do this. This is your priority. Because if I am guarding my heart well, I am going to be a better husband. I'm going to be a better dad. I'm going to be a better friend. I will be a better everything. So that's another giving yourself permission to do what is right for your heart.
That's right. Loving your neighbor means not allowing them to harm you, because you allowing someone to sit against you isn't showing them love. And so it's really easy for people pleasers to get all that twisted. It's like, oh, because I love this person, it means I have to allow them to harm me. No, it means just the opposite, right? And that harm could be just like stealing my time that I need to do this other thing, right? The harm doesn't have to be some terrible harm. It could be of like Thomas, the novel marketing podcast is harming me because I need that time for my audiobook business, right? It's not that the novel marketing podcast is bad. It's that there's a better use for that time. And I think it's a good test to see who your true friends are, because a true friend will be like, you know what, Jim, I want what's best for you and I want you to thrive. And so, yes, I'm happy to do this podcast without you. And a manipulative person will be like, no, I needed you. You can't leave me, right? And throw all these guilt trips.
Can't believe you're doing this to me.
Yeah, it was like, I thought you loved me, right? And twist it. And isn't it better to know who your true friends are, right? And I think you'd be surprised, most people are your true friends, right? Sure, there's manipulative folks, but I think we often will assume they're worse than they really are. And if they are that bad kind of person, you don't want to be in that relationship anyway.
Right. You don't. And sometimes, so Taylor is the one that came to me and said, Dad, I can't do Rhubarb Writing Academy anymore. And I know that was incredibly hard for him to say. And my immediate reaction was 60% of me was relieved and 40% of me was disappointed. By the next day, 80% of me was relieved and 20% of me was disappointed. And very quickly it was like, yep, this is right. Great. Awesome. And we both felt really good about it. So potentially you are pruning something and they're actually wanting to make a prune too, but they don't want to hurt your feeling. And so the ability to just step into that honesty and can sometimes have a better result than you might be expecting.
There's a thing that the Texas legislature does that I learned when I was a legislative aide as a young man called a sunset provision, where when we create a new bureaucracy or a new big expenditure of funds, typically the legislature will pass what's called a sunset provision, where that expenditure, that new department or that new agency automatically expires and goes away on such and such date in the future, unless the legislature passes a new bill to renew that department. And it forces the legislature to evaluate, is this still a thing that the government should still be doing? Right? Is this still needed? Sure, we needed that in 1930 when we created the Boll Weevil Eradication Fund. But do we still need the Boll Weevil Eradication Fund? Is this still the best way to solve that problem? And most often, the agency will have a sunset provision and they get re-upped for another 10 years or whatever. But sometimes things sunset and they just go away. They were needed for a season and then they leave. And I was like, if politicians who are known for not being responsible, right, they're profligate spenders, they're spending other people's money, if they can have that kind of discipline, surely we could have that kind of discipline too. And so don't commit to something forever, right? Be like, you know what, I'll do this for a year and then we'll revisit. And in a year, it's going to end unless we take action to renew it. Because nothing lasts forever. You're going to be dead. I'm going to be dead. We're all going to die, right? It's the ultimate statistic. And sometimes we die all at once, but often we die slowly, right? We get sicker and sicker. Our ability declines. The number of things that we're able to do decline. And I think that in some ways, age forces a pruning on you, right? Mm-hmm. So you're going on this bike race now, but you probably won't be able to do the same bike race in 20 years, right? It's probably not a lot of 80-year-olds who are going to do this bike race. There'll probably be some, right? There's always that one guy who's right. Defies all the laws of health and has a six-pack and is in his 80s. But for most of us, we realize, there's things I can't do anymore. And there's a sadness in that, but also a freedom in that of like, okay, now I don't have to feel bad about not doing it, because that season has come and that season is gone, and I'm going to embrace the season that I'm in. And the season of being a writer is a good season and it's worth making sacrifices for, but realize you're not committed to being a writer forever.
Right.
And unless you want to be, right? It's a great retirement activity. You want to write in your 80s, you can write in your 80s, but you don't have to. And that's really freeing, I think. And it also allows us to give it the focus that it needs in the moment, because we know that we're not committed for the rest of our lives.
Yes, it frees up other options. It opens our eyes. It lets us look around. And if we are willing to say the words, which you just said, I'm not going to be able to do X forever, whatever it is, then I think we make healthier choices right in the here and now. I mentioned Essentialism. Another book that I've read in the last 3 years that had a significant impact on me was a book called Die with a Zero. And it's exactly what you think it is. When you're dead, all the money's gone. You've spent it. You've spent it on these experiences, because at the end of your life, all you have is experiences. So be realistic, Jim. Are you really going to go to Europe when you're 90? Probably not. So if you want to take that trip to Iceland, you should probably do it now. You want to help your kids out? Honestly, Jim, they're not going to need it when they're 60 years old. They need it now, right? Give them money now because they probably need it for the down payment on the house. So face reality that time is coming to an end. And so make those choices, prune those things out of your life now.
Sometimes we avoid hard questions or facing hard realities until we have to, right? Don't be like I was, where I could not get out of bed because I was so overwhelmed with the number of different responsibilities I had. So many different things I had to work on that I literally could not function. Don't let it get to that point, because that can be traumatic, right? You prune a tree, you prune it too drastically, you can kill it, right? It depends on the tree. But some trees don't recover from a pruning, right? They would have if they were pruned sooner, but they waited too long and the tree dies. And you don't want that to happen to your writing career, right? So often what happens is we start with a lot of energy and a lot of hustle. And as we go, we get tired, but our readers are still expecting the pace of books that we were giving them before, right? If you were giving readers a book every 3 months, and you blasted out 3 books in 9 months, and now it's like, gosh, I don't know, right? You pick a pace you can deliver in a sustainable way long term.
Exactly. And if your pattern up until this point has been going and going and going, eventually the motor burns out. Anne Lamott has that famous saying where she says, many things are solved by just unplugging them and plugging them back in, including you. This idea of unplugging on a regular basis. And that's not easy to do because you got to write the novel, you got to market the novel, you got to research, you got to network, you got all these things. There is a never ending list of things you have to do. But if you are not taking that time every week and hopefully every day where there are moments of silence and quiet, you are going to burn out. And you're not even going to know it necessarily that you've burned out until you hit that point, like Thomas did, where it's like, oh, I can't move. Don't do that to yourself.
So what encouragement would you have for an author who knows they need to do some pruning, but they're afraid of missing out or they're afraid of hurting someone's feelings, right? They're about to quit doing something that they worked really hard to get. What advice would you have for that person?
I would take a whiteboard, put it up there, and just write all your major things that you do and go, you get to pick one, only one. And that's going to be painful. You might bring your spouse in on that or a close friend and go, all right, what do you see in me? I'm having such a tough time between these two. I've narrowed it down to 2 or 3. What do you see? And for example, with you, Thomas, I see the delight when you pour into people and you solve problems and you encourage them and you give them solutions. You light up. So it's like, well, Thomas, it's fairly obvious that you love teaching people. You love helping people on this publishing path. So it's like, you better keep doing that one, right? And so it's sometimes the outside friend.
I love that, kind of putting it on a whiteboard and getting it in front of you. I think the visibility is really key. For me, I have a spreadsheet. This is what I did back in 2019. In fact, I'll share a template of the spreadsheet if any of you want to go through this process. But basically, I have 3 columns: revenue, easiness, and joy. All right. So revenue is how much money does this bring in? Easiness is how easy is this to do? And then joy is how fun is this to do? And then they're all multiplied to give them a total score. And if something is not bringing in a lot of money, it's not easy, and it's not joyful, that's an easy thing to cut, right? Because the score is going to be really low. And I put all of my activities on this list. And I think that joy column was really helpful because it's really easy to just let money be our God and I'll just cut all the things that aren't bringing in money. But it's like, no, your hobbies are important. Your activities are important. You as a person, you're more than just a money-making machine. At least I hope you are. It's a really sad life if your whole goal is to die in the pyramid with the most treasures, because somebody is going to break into that pyramid and steal all your treasures at some point, right? Pyramids have no treasures in them today. Those guys who built them were fabulously wealthy, and there's no treasure in the pyramids.
I have used this technique. And when I did the process for the first time, what shocked me was, oh my gosh, there's 3 things on the bottom. They're gone immediately. And in a good way, took the emotion out of it, if that makes sense, because it's just like, oh, well, of course these have to go. And I didn't have to labor over them.
And the pruning doesn't have to be drastic. Sometimes just eliminating the worst thing on your list makes all the difference, right? You've got that one client who's a terrible client, and you let that client go. Now suddenly everything is going better. You have that one project that just is pulling you down, or you've got that one book idea that just is not working. It's like, you know what? Maybe this book idea isn't going to be my next book. I think for many of us, 20% of what we're doing results in 80% of our stress and draining and fatigue. And if you can identify that bottom 20% and just cut that, you've eliminated 80% of your stress, and you're so much happier and so much more productive and so much more creative, because you need to have that emotional energy and that emotional focus. And when all of your creative energies are going into your book, you're going to end up with a much stronger book than if your creative energies are being split 7 different ways. So, Jim, you don't have courses to sell. You don't really have a new book to promote.
I don't.
So where can people find out about your audiobook narrating if they're wanting to hire you to be the voice of their next book?
Yeah, you can go to my audio production website, secondmilestudios.com. I love doing audiobooks. About 60% has been fiction, and actually 30% has been nonfiction. So I'm doing a little of both and really enjoying it. So yeah, love to send you some samples and talk to you about it.
And we'll have a link to Second Mile Studios in the show notes for this episode. And don't forget, June 2023 is Patron Appreciation Month. So all new and existing patrons get a free copy of my course, Publishing A to Z. So this course normally costs $299, but patrons get lifetime access for as little as $4. So this is a really good time to become a patron if you've been thinking about it. But it has to be in the month of June 2023. Speaking of new patrons, our new patrons who joined in the month of May, it's Carter Phillips, Richard Ashley Young, Tom Gooden, Luke Crouch, Anne Marie Stewart, Joe Fitzgerald, Janine McNally, Kimberly Willard, MC Weaver, Raphael Casas, Jenny McKinney, Ruth Schmeckpepper, Robin Renee Monroe, Debbie Sorensen, Dennis Conrad, Meg McDonald, and Joy V. Thank you so much for becoming patrons of the Novel Marketing Podcast. I really appreciate your support. And don't forget to activate your free copy of Publishing A to Z before the end of the month. The Novel Marketing Podcast is a production of Author Media. Our guest today was James L. Rubart. Our producer is Lori Christine, audio engineering by William Umstadt, and the blog post version is crafted by Shauna Lettler. To read the blog version of this episode, visit authormedia.com/375. I'm Thomas Umstadt Jr. saying thank you for listening and live long and prosper.